Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew Brandt. I'm a principal researcher at Sophos Labs. That's an antivirus company from the UK. And I am going to be talking about the terrible stuff that's been happening to my Honeypot that I run on my lab network. I run a malware research lab out of my home in Colorado, and this is just some of the bad stuff that comes flowing into the network from outside. And I do this for a number of reasons, but mainly to collect some threat intelligence, but also to just sort of learn what attackers are doing. And this talk is called, Hey, you got your SQL in my Honeypot. So I'll tell you a little bit about my lab. We'll talk about the attack. I'm going to be talking about I'm going to give you some older data that talks about the way that the attack worked and the relationships between the attackers and the files that they were loading as a payload. That data is kind of old now. It's about a year old, but it's still fairly relevant. And then I'm going to talk about some tools that you can use yourself to do some of that kind of correlation yourself if you wanted to replicate this in your own environment. So in my lab, I have a number of different tools that I use to collect data. I have some packet capture tools. I do some SSL man-in-the-middle interception so that I can look at the contents of, for example, there's several malware families that communicate purely over HTTPS. This allows me to see the unencrypted content of their command and control traffic, or sometimes the payloads as they're delivered from HTTPS websites. Can I grab my bottle? Grab my drink. Sorry, didn't mean to walk off the stage during the talk, but I forgot my beverage. And most importantly is I run a bunch of these honeypots, which I use to, essentially, they're an attractive nuisance on my network. So I have a very unobtrusive home DSL connection, but it's a fairly high bandwidth for DSL. It's not the greatest. It's not like Utah bandwidth. But I put these honeypots on the DMZ and I allow everything that's out there to kind of hit them, and they get hit with a lot of stuff. The honeypot that I'm using is this one. It's called the T-pot, and it's made by Deutsche Telekom, otherwise known as the German parent company of T-Mobile. The website there, that GitHub address, is where you can download. You can either build your own version of the honeypot with the Docker containers that contain each individual honeypot component, or you can just pull down an ISO, and if you have either a bare metal machine or a virtual machine, I run mine in ESX, and it works great with 2 gigs of RAM and about 100 megs of storage, and it has a ton of honeypots. So everything is Dockerized and containerized, which is great. I used to run individual honeypots on individual machines. So I had one machine that was just running Diana, one machine that was just running Cowrie, and this is so much more efficient. And it also allows me to monitor the performance of each of those honeypots, and it also means, one machine. In addition to all the honeypots, though, it has an entire data collection stack that's built into the honeypot tool itself. So you can, it has a full elk stack, and it also has a lot of tools that allow you to do monitoring of the network connectivity, the performance of the machine itself, the individual performance of every little Docker container and the honeypots that are in them, updating them individually. It's a really great self-contained way to start doing honeypot work if you've never done it before. And it also, so because it's part of Deutsche Telekom's network infrastructure. It's hosted by them, created by them. Sorry, not hosted by them, but they host the code. They have embedded in it a little bit of telemetry that sends back some attack data back to them, and so they're using that to kind of monitor attack data as well. But obviously, you get access to everything that they're collecting, and they have this nice little pew-pew map that they have on this website, sicherheitstaco.eu. And it just shows sort of real-time attack data. If you browse to the web page, I mean, it's a honeypot, so it's running services on a huge number of ports. the just sort of HTTP port will just generate this, this weird paragraph of a kind of Jane Austen-like language mixed with some security and network IT terms. It's dynamic, so it kind of regenerates this every time you reload the page, but it has a login form, and it kind of looks like a blog and has a blog comment field. And the best thing about collecting data from this is the blog comment spammers find it within about 30 seconds of it being online, and then suddenly you're getting all those great URLs for the various pill vendor websites and all the other stuff that they want to comment spam. For a company like mine, it's great because you can then immediately classify those URLs as being something that you wouldn't want people to go to. Right, so to do a little bit of testing on this, I ran a bunch of tools against it just to see, what it looks like to the outside world and what it would look like if you were, scanning it with NMAP. And so this is the scan result from NMAP, and it shows that the services that are running are that it's got both Linux and Windows running on it, and it shows as a storage device, a printer. The printer is labeled as a Konica Minolta printer. It also shows that it's running Microsoft SQL Server 2000 SP1 Plus. I don't know what that is. And a bunch of other things. That's kind of relevant here because it's that SQL Server tool, which is called MySQLD, that's the honeypot, that is being attacked in this case. Right? And then there's, earlier today there was a talk, I think it was in this room, about using Shodan to kind of do some profiling of your network. And I thought, well, I don't have a Shodan slide on here, so I should really do one. So just before the talk, I went and looked at what the IP address looks like on Shodan. And I'm not sure if there's like a maximum limit of the number of ports that Shodan will actually show you, but it's pretty close to the maximum limit because basically everything is open. And so there's just tons of stuff that's open on this machine. The headers are all also dynamically generated by the honeypots. So every time Shodan kind of scans it, it will create new headers that the header data, it screws Shodan up a little bit, but we all know that it's bad, right? It services tons of attacks. There's cross-site scripting, there's all this comment spamming stuff. Glassdoff, which is the honeypot that manages all that, gets really like about almost a third of the attacks are basically against HTTP. The next most common thing that's usually hitting it are these SSH brute forcing attacks, where basically there's a machine that's running in Vietnam that sends something like 100,000 usernames and password combinations, just trying to brute force it over and over and over again. And it basically takes, it's like a quarter of the stuff is coming from Vietnam. There's of course FTP stuff that's coming in. There's all kinds of crawler bots that are just hitting the website constantly. And then yeah, everything else. I mean, basically if there's a service that's out there, it's hosting it, and if there's someone out there who's attacking it, it's receiving those attacks, and it's just a nonstop barrage, right? So let's talk about what the honeypot caught this time. So this is a screenshot from the packet capture tool that I use, which is a product of my former employer, so I can't actually name it, but it has to do with security and involves a lot of analytics. The tool basically records all of this traffic and then outputs all this metadata about the traffic into this a UI that's kind of Splunk-like. It's not a SIM, but it kind of works like a SIM. What it shows is that, this is a 7-day period that I'm showing here from the 9th to the 15th of July last summer, so a year ago. And this is just all of the sort of background noise that was hitting in a 1-week period. And what I started to notice at sort of early last year was that all these normal ports like the Telnet and SSH and HTTP, HTTPS were, they're all represented, as well as things like, SMB, and just anything that you would think of attacking, remote desktop. But then this port 1433 would pop up, and at that time I didn't really know what that port was used for. Of course, I later learned that it was part of that. It's that MySQLD honeypot. So looking at this same 7-day period last year, out of all traffic that was coming in there was probably, you can see that there's like a huge number of connections from Vietnam. That's those guys that are doing the brute forcing on the SSH. Other than that, you can see it's fairly well distributed from all of the usual suspects, including from right here at home in the US, and roughly 261,000 visits from various machines over a 7-day period. Just looking at the 1433 TCP for that same time slice, you can see that the big blue Pac-Man of that graph that's on the right is the traffic from China, and everything else is kind of pales in comparison. It was roughly 77% from China last year at about this time. So let's jump forward. Oh, sorry, and I want to say, yeah, and then just looking at the traffic from China, you can see that, yeah, roughly looks like 65.39% of the sessions involved were the SSH brute forcing. But in there, fourth down from the top, just rolling in at about 3.4% of all the traffic from China was this application of TDS, which I did not know what it meant. I later found out that it's called tabular data stream. That's the file format, or the communications format for doing SQL commands over the network. All right, so flash forward to this year, and looking at a wider time slice of what's been hitting this same machine. Now this attack has not been, it has not abated in any way in the past 18 months. In fact, it's gotten bigger. So looking at just the traffic that's on this port 1433, inbound from anywhere and spread out over a wider window, 2 months. So this is going back from pretty much from this week, going back to the end of July. Almost looks like 85 and just under 85.5% of that traffic that's coming in on this TDS port that is used by the database server is coming from China. So it's still a huge percentage coming from China. I wrote a few weeks after I started to notice this, I wrote a rule that was just called, someone tried to exploit the honeypot using TDS SQL attacks and started to kind of keep track of it. So this is within like 2 weeks of creating this rule, there have been 14,000 attacks. It was coming in, and it says here like 2 to 30 per hour. That rate has kind of upped itself since then to almost 45 an hour at the top rate. It literally never stops. There are gaps of a few seconds, and then the attack starts over again. And as I said, about 3/4 to 4/5 of it is coming from China, and it is a huge amount of data from a single country targeting a single port. And so I thought it was a pretty good and interesting avenue for investigation, right? And there's so many different kinds of attacks. There's really only time for just the one. So let's talk a little bit about it. All right. So how does it work? Okay, before we even get into the beginning of the attack, I want to give you just some statistics to sort of lay out the framework of how it works. The typical attack doesn't really last more than 3.5 minutes, right? 210 seconds is basically the top end of this, and that is purely due to network constraints. So again, this is a honeypot that's hosted on a 40 megabit per second DSL connection, and there's so much stuff that's just flowing in, plus all of the regular dirty traffic from my lab network is also coming through this same connection, and occasionally it just gets congested and clogged. So that's the only reason that it ever slows down, is because too much stuff is happening. Each individual attack comprises fewer than 500 packets of data total. And the way that the TDS protocol works is that it's basically one session. So the TCP session opens, everything happens within that session, and at the end of it, it closes the session. So it makes it very easy because you can count the sessions. It literally is a count of the attack. And it says, there's been basically about 150,000 of these since the beginning of 2017. That's an estimate because I don't have the storage to store all the packets going back that far in time. But that's basically, that's my assumption, is that it's pretty close to, it's actually probably pretty close to 200,000 at this point, since I started to notice it. All right, what are the elements of the attack? Okay, so there's really like 3 stages to it, but the first stage is very complicated. The second stage is also very complicated, so I'm going to break it out into pieces as best I can. I am not a SQL database, like I am not a DB admin and don't know, like I could not write SQL code if you asked me to. Everything I did here I had to kind of figure out, do a lot of Google searching and learn about SQL to figure out exactly what they were doing. But here's what I learned. So this is the this is a little graph that someone created that sort of describes how TDS works, this tabular data stream protocol. The first thing that the attacker is doing is they kind of profile the machine, they're querying the environment settings of the box, and they're trying, and they do this in a number of different ways. And in fact, one of the biggest things, one of the things you can say that's the consistent thing about this attack is that if they can figure out one way to do it, they will figure out 5 different ways to do it, and then they will do it those 5 different ways, and they'll do it 5 times. Everything about it is redundant, and it's just over and over again the same kind of stuff, used in doing it in different methods to sort of, I guess, to get around bugs or to try to figure out. I mean, this way, I guess they can create automation that is applicable to a broader set of database servers, and then they can just run the automation and just let it go. So it sets up these things called stored procedures and extended stored procedures. A stored procedure is essentially a series of commands, and an extended stored procedure can be a longer series of commands, or can even be files or calls to the operating system. It creates a lot of these things. It basically is adding entries to tables that it creates in the database, and then it calls those tables. It invokes those stored procedures to trigger the SQL Server to do things like pull down payloads, change settings on the machine, add, remove, change the configuration of, change the password of various credentials that are created on the database server. And really, like, the attacker thinks this is just an old Windows box, but of course it's not. It's just a honeypot. The way that the honeypot works, by the way, and it's kind of cool, it's brilliant in its way, it's so simple, is basically anytime the database gets any kind of a query, it will prompt for a password. It doesn't matter what password you enter. It will just say accepted, and then it just asks you to start delivering the SQL commands. And with every SQL command it receives, it says, oh, that was accepted, give me some more. And so the honeypot is very, very good at trapping this particular type of automated attack. There's only 122 steps that I've been able to identify. It always does the same 122 steps in the same order. I'm assuming that means that this is automation. I certainly hope it's not the same guy typing in these commands. There's this link on Pastebin that you can take a look at where I've posted a page that basically is the sequence of all of the commands. There's too many to go through, so I'm just going to summarize what most of them are. But basically, yeah, the server just responds. Anytime it gets a command, it's just responding with, okay, yeah, let's do it. We're going to go and do some more stuff. All right, so beginning the attack. It's going to take control. So the first thing it's doing is it logs in. It tells the database server, I am an administrator. The database server says, okay, you're an administrator, go ahead. And it starts doing things like taking control of the box, including deleting a bunch of the stored procedures that are part of MS-SQL Server, or that would be likely to be part of a standard installation of a Microsoft SQL Server. So all these drop procedures that you see in the first screenshot, they're all standard things that are part of MS-SQL Server. And then it creates new ones with the same name, and it's pretty obvious why. They want to be able to create their stored procedure that has the commands that do the things that they want the database server to do when that stored procedure is called, rather than the default, normal thing that the database server would do. it sets the owner of the database as user SA, and then it sets the maximum data output to 2 gigabytes. That means that it would essentially means that the database server will allow the attacker to continue sending data until this 2 gigabyte data limit is reached, and then it would cut it off. Essentially, it just means that the entire attack can happen, and it doesn't give any kind of an error about hitting a buffer. All right, so it's deleting registration. So this is what's one of the amazing things about this SQL Server stuff is that the database server is capable from within the database of manipulating the operating system. And I wasn't aware of this. This is new to me. But it can invoke regedit, and it can invoke other tools on Windows that'll allow it to change registry keys, open registry keys, enter new ones. And so that's what it does. It basically unregisters and re-registers a bunch of things to make sure that these DLLs that apparently are something that it will need in the future, and these executables like ftp.exe and cackles, it wants to make sure that all of that stuff is there. So it gives the database process the permissions to run these executables. It deletes keys that are part of the registry that are called IFIO keys. IFIO stands for Image File Execution Options. And if you look in the Windows registry under the registry entry for every executable that's properly registered, there will be an entry for image file execution options. The way that that's used under normal circumstances is for developers. If they're doing debugging, they will have their debugger hook the executable, and so then when you double-click the executable, instead of running the executable, it's supposed to run the debugger, which then loads the executable. But this can be used to hijack things in multiple different ways. I mean, for myriad reasons, it's been used by malware. It's also used by the sysinternals tool Process Explorer. When you tell Process Explorer to replace the default task manager in Windows, all it does is it sets the IFIO key so that when you try to go to task manager, it launches Process Explorer instead. So it's deleting these IFIO keys because a conscientious and knowledgeable sysadmin can actually set IFIO keys as a protective measure to prevent certain executables like ftp.exe from being run. Well, if you delete those keys, and then then you can basically bypass all of those protections. It removes group policy keys that also disable the command prompt and FTP and cackles, and it changes the macro security level to low for the Jet engine server. All right. Once it's done all that, and again, we're only maybe half a second into the attack. It's deleting these group policy registry keys that, if they're set, they'll disable the command line, but keep it from running at startup, right? So that you basically can avoid having your command line invoke like a new group policy when the machine reboots and then restore everything that they're trying to turn off. It also goes through the registry looking for certain auto-run entries for things that I'm not really familiar with. They have names like AUT1, AUT2, and shell. Presumably, these are auto-runs that are set up by other attackers who try to get into servers and have things auto-run in a default way. Presumably, the people who are behind this recognize that there are competitors out there who may have broken into the machine before them, and they eliminate all the competition. Okay, now we're only step 4. There's probably just a couple more phases in phase 1, or parts of phase 1. So next thing it's going to do is it's going to use this extended stored procedure in XP to start SQL Server Agent, which is the Microsoft SQL Server process on the machine as a service, and it tells it to make it start automatically at boot. That's just, makes sense. If you're going to be using the database server to do everything else, you want to make sure that that database server is still available. If the box were to crash or reboot, you want it to still run afterwards. But then it's dumping out a file called 123.bat, And that file, that batch file, is doing the sort of the same things that the registry hacking pieces were doing in the previous slide, right? So they're adjusting the ACL on these files to make them system. It's adjusting the ACL on run DLL32 to make it run for everybody. It's deregistering and re-registering the same DLLs that were 2 slides ago, and it's pulling down a DLL from a remote server and then registering that as well. That's one of the key components here, is that if it can't pull down that DLL and load it and have that loaded at startup after the next time, it doesn't allow the rest of the thing to run. And then the final thing it does is pulls down this MSI installer from a remote location and runs it. Right? Okay, we're almost done with phase 1. It's going to create this INI file in the system32 folder, and it creates a whole bunch of ACL data for again, the same files that it's trying to make sure are available, and it is invoking secedit to add that to secedit.db by saying, secedit perf strings e.ini. And it adds that. Again, it's just a redundant method of doing the same thing it's done in the previous 2 slides, right? Then it has one of the commands that it will pull, one of the cells that are entries that it puts into a database table is this giant blob of hex data. And it invokes a command that then takes the contents of that database entry and turns it into a file which is called myusago.dvr, and it writes that out into the system folder, and that runs a bunch of wget commands to pull down more components and run it, right? So the one problem with this is that it has done this for a really long time, and as far as I can tell, and I don't know whether it's just because I'm in the United States and they're doing some kind of geo-filtering on the way that the web server works, but that file has not been available ever. As far as I can tell, the website is down and the file has never been available. So why is that still in the automation? I don't know. I think we may be dealing with some of the laziest hackers ever. All right, and then once we get down to sort of the end of this phase where it's trying to sort of make sure that it's the only thing running and it's got everything arranged for itself, it's creating some of these folders, right? They're called Shengda Mainsoft and Kugu 2010. It doesn't put anything into those folders. It just creates the folders and leaves them in C program files or C program files x86. It also has a whole long list of what are called jobs. These are automated, sort of like autoruns within the database, and it will delete all of those database jobs. And we are basically at the halfway point, and it has done everything that it's trying to do at least 4 different ways. In the process of doing all this stuff, it reveals these indicators of compromise. These are the locations of some of these files that it's trying to pull down. Some of these are live and some of them are not. And it's important to keep track of this. We're going to use this later to kind of look at what these files are and what are the relationships between the files, these URLs, and other things that we've seen that are used in attacks. All right, phase 2, right? So now, once it has done all of this configuration and it's just basically spent half of its effort at just getting the machine to where it needs it to be, now it's actually going to start doing the commands. So up until now, it's just been invoking these stored procedures, and this job killer is like the longest of the stored procedures with the 54 different jobs. But then, what they're starting to do is they are entering these, like I said, they're creating these entries in the database, which are just giant blobs of hex. And actually, what I can do is, if you don't mind, I will switch out of the presentation just for a second. And I'm going to bring up Wireshark and just show you what that looks like. So what I have done, make sure that that's in there. Oh, look how tiny that is. I'm not expecting you to read that. What I've done is I've done a follow TCP stream in Wireshark. And what you can see here is that this is just a giant blob of hex that is embedded into one of the tables in the database. And it just, all it does is just writes this into the table of the database, and then it invokes a command that then writes the contents of this table to a file, and it just so happens that it has that magic bytes of 4D5A at the beginning, which means it's an executable. So just wanted to show you that, just to give you a sense of what we're dealing with here. Can I get back to my slideshow? Yes. Bam. So there are 9 of these are just really, really complicated SQL commands, and one of them is that file. Okay. With the data files prefixed with a SQL command, right? It's doing this. This is what of course, I didn't, want to show you this on that tiny little screen. So I've zoomed in on it, right? So these varchar 8000s, that's basically the introduction, or sort of like the header of that database table entry that contains the executable. There are so many of these stored procedures, so I can't go through all of them. But what I've done is I've kind of I've collected them into a group of basically there are 10 stored procedures, and I've kind of collected them to sort of sequence them this way. Like I said, some of them are executable files. Many of them, though, are just hex-encoded text, and the hex-encoded text is itself SQL commands. So it's just another way of just sort of throwing more and more SQL commands into the database and getting them to run in different ways, presumably to avert security protection measures. So first 4 procedures. And the way that I've got them organized here is because it does 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, but stored procedures 1 and 3 are redundant, and 2 and 4 are redundant. So I've kind of collected them as their sort of basically the package, right? So the first package goes out and it gets this file called kill.html from a weird website, and the contents of that are a list of Windows processes that might be running on a machine that's got a database server on it. And so they may be, in a lot of cases, so there's hundreds of these files in this kill file. So it's the names of the executables of every large antivirus, endpoint antivirus product that you can imagine, as well as a bunch of other protective tools that might be running on there, things like Carbon Black, that it wants to kill off the database server so that it doesn't leave traces of its activity behind, or it doesn't get stopped by one of these endpoint AVs. So it goes and it walks through the Windows scripting engine, and it just does task kill /f/im on each one of these things all down this giant list. And then the next stage is to go and get this payload called test.html from a different web address, and invokes ADODB stream to download that, and then the Windows scripting host runs these files that are the payloads. And the Windows scripting host thing downloads these DLLs that have this .sct extension on them, and re-registers them as DLLs. And then tries to pull another DLL from a different website, this js.mykings.top domain, and that's another one that is frequently not accessible or available. It has only worked a very few number of times. Talk about redundant. So stage 5, it's once again reduplicating the DLL registration. It's also doing things like cleaning up the browser cache and creating a run key for a batch file that it writes out to the system, and downloading some executables that have a JPEG extension on them, presumably to avoid detection by a really dumb intrusion detection system that would notice something with an exe extension but wouldn't look at the magic bytes in the first 2. So yeah, kind of dumb. I really don't think these are the sharpest hackers in the shed, but they are really, really, let's just say this. If nothing, they are dedicated to their cause, and they're going to try every method that they can to get onto these machines. Right. Finally, at this point, it's going to encrypt the database. So, and not just the pieces of the database that they've been messing with, but the entire thing. So it checks to see if its credentials are sufficient, and then it goes and it encrypts them, and if it's not, then it gives itself the credentials because it's able to sort of create a username for itself with administrative properties, and then it uses that account to basically do it. So either way, it's going to encrypt the database. And then the last piece of this is it's one of these stored procedures is this .NET managed DLL, and the DLL contains in it a URL embedded in it, and that text file that is in the URL contains a couple of different other payload URLs and the names of the payloads and where they're supposed to go on the targeted, like the victim system, which is in that white box at the bottom of the page here. And they do change over time, but like, at the moment they're this. All right, and now the last thing that they're doing, now we're into like, at the 2-minute mark here, the last thing that they're doing is that they are messing with the passwords for all the accounts in the database system. So it creates a sysadmin account called MS-SQL, and it gives it this very specific password, bus 3456 pound QWEIN, which I guess is that's a pretty secure password if you didn't actually transmit it in plain text over TDS. But then it goes through, and the bottom box here, you can see that it runs these stored procedures of nulling out the passwords for a bunch of accounts on the machine and then changing them to this one that's here, which starts with accent 4, YQBM 4, and I'm not going to try and read the rest of the punctuation, but you can see it's an even longer, complex, punctuation-filled password, and then it logs all those accounts out. So it's locked all those accounts down, almost kind of like what a ransomware would do, only it has not done a ransom request. And then finally, once it cleans up, it deletes all these trace files, a lot of the batch files, some of the DLLs. It does leave behind some of the executables in certain locations, and it wipes out those folders that it created earlier in the program files thing. And again, remember that it was only 2 minutes ago that it created those folders, and it never put anything in them, and now it's deleting them. Why? I don't know. And I would really like to know, but I don't think I'm ever going to learn. I still think these are just a bunch of really dumb people. It may be that it's some kind of sanity check, but I don't know. To me, it just smacks of someone was just messing around. Right. So that's it. That's the whole of the attack. It's there to basically deliver a couple of executables. All that effort, all that reconfiguring of the database, all that encrypting of the database with a really long, stupid password, all of it to deliver an executable. Let's talk about that. So the company I used to work for had a really interesting threat intelligence tool that's called Billiard Room. And the way that Billiard Room worked was the company had a reputation service that knew a lot about the behavior of certain malware and what it talked to, like if the malware spoke to a certain IP address or was delivered from a certain domain. That was part of this reputation service, and Billiard Room would let you do things like query by looking at the IP address or the domain name or the email address of the domain name's registrant, and or the hash of the file, and it would generate this sort of map that it was a relationship map dynamically based on all of the detonations of malware that was running in the lab. And it would tell you all kinds of great stuff, like where something was hosted, when it was hosted there and for how long, what the reputation was of that IP address or the domain where something was hosted. If there's malware, it would sometimes give you the directionality of whether it spoke to or was delivered by a certain domain. It was very cool. And the sources were from the database service. It was from one of my previous employers. Just in the last week, actually just on Friday, I stumbled upon this brand new GitHub that was created by by a couple of people, and it's called Danger Zone. And what it is essentially everything that I just mentioned about Billiard Room minus the malware behavioral stuff. So it doesn't have the, you can't search the malware hashes and see where malware talked to or was received from certain IPs or domains, but it does have those relationships about the domains and IPs, and everything is queried from open source intelligence, right? Things like VirusTotal, domain tools, and everything else that you can imagine. It's querying all that stuff, and it kind of collects it into a very similar kind of map. So if you wanted to create your own system like this, I would say check out Danger Zone. I have not used it myself, so I cannot attest to how good it is, but the fact that it just popped into existence in the last couple of weeks is noteworthy, and I thought I'd mention it here. So these are the IOCs that I wanted to look for in this attack, right? So there's these domains that were involved in the delivery of some of the components, or in some cases they were just embedded URLs that were in the files that were being dropped, but I never saw any communication because it's not actually running the malware in a real database server. So there's these 3 hashes that were delivered and 5 domains that I wanted to know more about. So plugging that stuff into Billiard Room creates this crazy quilt map that kind of looks like a giant exploded molecule of relationships, right? And I'll just briefly mention what these relationships are. The blue dots are IP addresses. The green dots are web domains, or sorry, the blue dots are web domains, the green dots are IP addresses. In some cases, it treats the IP address like a web domain, so there may be a blue and green dot for the same place. And then the sort of orangey things with the biohazard symbol in them are obviously malware samples, and the arrows indicate whether the malware came from a thing or was talking to a thing after it was run. The samples and the domains that are part of our original query, that query of 3 hashes and 5 domains, are circled in these red boxes. Actually, just the files are circled in the red boxes, or boxed in the red boxes. And it's notable to see that they originate from a number of different domains, a number of different IP addresses. I wanted to take one quick look at the rectangular box at the bottom, which if you take a closer look at it, you can see that this one hash has a link to a website called blog.sina.com.cn. For those who don't know, Sina is one of China's biggest web providers, web properties, and they do have a free blogging service, as well as a million other things. They're kind of like the Yahoo of China. And I was curious about this because I really wanted to see what this thing was talking to. So I ran the sample, which was a Windows executable, in a malware sandbox. And what I saw was that it communicated with a particular blog on a particular page on Sina.com, and the content of that page was this base64 encoded blob. That was the only thing that this blog ever posted. And I thought this was really a cool thing. We've seen people use Twitter and other kinds of social media for command and control purposes. This is the first time I'd ever seen a blog purpose-built to be used for command and control purposes. And you can see that command that's under the blog name UPS has not changed since last March, or I should say a year ago March. I just thought that was cool. All right, so looking at the one of these domains that's in here, which is sig2016.xyz, that actually plugging that one domain into this Billiard Room tool created this entire map. This relationship map came out of this is hosted here, what else is hosted here, what else is, where else are these things that are hosted here, or where have they been hosted in the past? And so several layers deep, you can see that all of this stuff is kind of connected to a bunch of domains and a bunch of files that we now know are related to the Mirai botnet. The files that are being delivered are not Mirai. Because this is a Microsoft SQL server and Mirai targets embedded systems that are running things like ARM and ARM64 and MIPS processors. These are Win32 and Win64 downloads. It was really interesting to kind of figure out what this thing was actually pulling down to a Microsoft SQL server. It was crypto mining. Hooray! So these guys went to all this trouble to deliver a crypto miner to a database server. And they're doing it 45 times a minute. Some of the samples were detected as Mirai. When I looked up the hashes on VirusTotal, they are flagged as Mirai. That doesn't necessarily mean that's accurate, because a lot of the times, and I speak from personal experience working for a bunch of different endpoint antivirus companies, occasionally antivirus companies are less precise with their categorization and giving things a virus name that then ends up in VirusTotal than they could be. They're not necessarily diligent, and so occasionally things that are coming from domains that are known to be associated with malware type A will be named malware type A, even though they might be malware type B. And so that's basically what seems to be happening in this case. Most of the C2 domains that were used in this had been observed being used by Mirai botnet gangs in the past. And in fact, they were very prolifically used for that purpose. So it's reasonable to understand why these crypto miners got flagged as Mirai, but they're not. And I think it's reasonable to say that this poses a sort of a risk for these machines, especially because this is a database server that's supposed to be relatively old. I just worked on a project with an organization called the Cyber Threat Alliance. They're an organization that is a sort of a grouping of a bunch of cybersecurity companies that want to be able to share data about attacks more carefully. And I worked on a report that we published earlier this month that was all about crypto mining. And it was talking about a lot of the risks associated with crypto mining. One of the biggest risks that I found personally is that crypto mining can cause machines to overheat to the point where they actually are physically damaged. If you've built a badge here in the con, you know that you can flow your solder in just the wrong way and make a little solder bridge and just short the whole thing out. It's really easy to do. I will tell you my anecdote. I had a machine that I ran in my lab for years that was an old Dell D620 laptop, and it was great because it could run anything. And unlike a virtual machine, it was able to run malware that was sandbox evasive, because it was just a real machine that I would run the malware on it sometimes for weeks at a time just to see where that malware would communicate with, or when it would pull down payloads, where the payloads would come from. That machine, I installed an Emotet bot on it. Well, this was going on 6 months ago. I installed Emotet on it, and Emotet, after 3 days of running and not doing anything, pulled down a crypto miner. And I did not realize this because it did this like Friday at like 9 p.m., and I didn't look at that machine again until Monday. When I next looked at it, it was turned on with the fan running at top speed and just nothing on screen. I couldn't get it to wake up. And occasionally this laptop had a problem where it would periodically overheat, and I would just have to power it down, let it cool off, and then turn it on again. This laptop never came back from that state. The fan was, after I opened it up and took a look, I discovered that the fan probably had gotten jammed or was just not running fast enough, and the solder on a memory controller that was just underneath the CPU heatsink, that the solder had flowed over several of the pins of that controller chip, and that there was no way of repairing that short of getting in there with soldering iron and some solder braid and kind of removing that and trying to like reflow the solder over a surface mount. It's not the kind of thing that your average IT person is going to know how to do, B, have the time to diagnose and see. Like, they're not going to bother, right? If you got a machine that the motherboard goes bad, you're going to throw that whole machine away and start over. And the real problem with a lot of these crypto miners is that they do run at extended periods of time, and they cause mechanical failures simply because they overtax the systems that they're running on. So it's a pretty big risk. Anyway, talking about some of the pitfalls here, like some of the pitfalls in doing this kinds of cross-referencing is that there can be malware sinkholes, there can be open DNS servers, and parking hosts where domains get hosted when they have nothing on them, but they've been registered. So it does take a little bit of cleaning up to look at this data and actually understand what it is you're looking at. But if you're able to kind of weed through some of that stuff, this kind of cross-referencing can be actually quite illuminating and very useful. And I have a few minutes for questions, so I'm going to say, give me at least 2 questions, and the people who ask questions will get a little prize. I have some Sophos socks that are really cool, and I have a big bar of chocolate for people who don't like socks. So shoot with the questions. Nobody wants socks. Come on, you can ask me anything up here. Go ahead. What was that? So the question is, are there honeypots out there that you can just stick in your DMZ and go, or do you have to build them all yourself? No, yes, there are, and this is one of them. So this T-pot, honeypot, you can download an ISO, and it's all built, and basically you just run the ISO, and it goes through the install process and asks for some configuration information, and then at the end of that process, it reboots, and you are running a honeypot on that machine. And it's fully self-contained. Now, the only thing that I would caution you about with using the T-pot is it does take some of the telemetry and sends it off to this third party, Deutsche Telekom. If you don't trust them, then you might not want to use that. But there are others as well. I would say that they are not as sophisticated and not as well built as the T-pot. The T-pot is really the most complete, simplest way to get started with honeypot threat intelligence collection that I know of. And I've run a whole lot of them. So hope that answers your question. Come up and get your prize afterwards. Okay, so the question is, how does having a honeypot on your network make your organization more secure? Okay, so there's 2 ways that honeypots help you. So I use it for threat intelligence collection. That is not something that every organization needs to do, but it is often useful to understand who your attackers are and what they are attacking you with, at least for the easy stuff. Having a honeypot out on the public-facing side of your DMZ means that it becomes that honeypot is an attractive nuisance, and you will see what attackers are trying to get in with. What that gives you is a whole long laundry list of things that you need to do as an IT admin to kind of clean your network up, and the basic stuff that you need to do patching, password changes or management, turning off things like remote access to the public through the DMZ. On Thursday, I'm giving a talk about malware called SamSam. That's a ransomware that the attacker is using basically manual techniques. The attacker is hand-delivering the malware into the network using standard sysadmin tools and standard sysadmin commands. Most of those break-ins happen by brute forcing an RDP connection into the network and then trying to get onto a domain controller and get the domain admin password using Mimikatz. So one of the things that you can learn from just knowing that that happens is, for the love of God, turn off remote desktop. Please, don't even open that hole in the firewall for the CEO. It's not worth it. Number 2, patch everything. Those lessons are easy, and yet it's very, very difficult to teach them, especially in a face of, we're all busy people, and we have, businesses that we need to help run, or organizations we're trying to keep online. How do we know what to prioritize? I mean, there's a million things that we need to do that are just basic stuff. It helps you to kind of show the bosses, This is where the attackers are trying to hit us. These are the weak points that they are hammering us with. Give me the budget and the resources or the people or whatever it is that I need to fix these holes because this is terrible. I mean, number two is, what else is, the other benefit is, it's a thing that you could put in your network as an attractive nuisance that will cause no harm to anything if it does get compromised. It's a machine you can basically take this VM and just recycle it back into its native state at the end of it. If for some reason the hackers figure out that they're running in a honeypot and they find some exploit against a honeypot to break out of the honeypot, all they've broken into is the machine hosting the honeypot. They're still not on your database server or your SQL server. All right, there was one other question. It is specifically a tool that does full packet capture and then extracts traffic metadata from the packets. But because it's a product of my former employer, I can't say the name. But talk to me afterwards. Yeah, it's more than a SIM, but it has SIM-like characteristics and a UI. Yeah. Anything else? 3 minutes early. We don't have to go right to 4:30. Thanks, everybody. And the two people who ask questions, please come up and get your socks.